We need to have a very serious, very uncomfortable, and completely honest conversation about what the footage from the Phoenix Mercury game is showing. Because there are multiple layers of documented evidence here that raise questions the analytical community cannot responsibly set aside. And those questions belong in the permanent public record of what this Indiana Fever season has been producing with increasing frequency and increasing specificity. Let us start with what the footage actually shows, because the specificity of the documented sequence is the analytical foundation of everything that follows. We are not working from assumptions or speculation. We are working from what cameras captured and what the broadcast documented during the game. Clark hit a three-pointer. In the sequence immediately preceding the turnover that became the focal point of the coaching response, Clark had also generated assists. She was producing at an elite level. She was the competitive engine of whatever offensive momentum Indiana was maintaining in that game. She then turned the ball over. On the possession following that turnover, Clark did not sprint back on defense at the pace the coaching staff apparently expected. The opposing team converted. Stephanie White called a timeout. What the footage captures in that timeout sequence is White visibly agitated, the body language, the urgency of the timeout call, the competitive frustration that is readable on camera from the sideline without any interpretive stretch. That footage is what it is, and what follows the timeout is what the analytical community is now specifically and carefully examining. Clark was removed from the game. She did not return to the floor in any meaningful competitive capacity after that specific moment. And the broadcast went approximately 30-plus minutes without providing any substantive information about her status or her condition. The back injury narrative emerged following the game as the organizational explanation for why Clark was not on the floor after being removed in the third quarter. That is the framing that has been offered. And the back situation is something that needs to be engaged with honestly, rather than either accepted wholesale without examination or dismissed entirely without evidence. But here is where the footage raises the questions that cannot be responsibly avoided by anyone who has been tracking this season's documented patterns. The footage shows Clark in the huddle following her removal from the game, not sitting at the end of the bench with visible training staff attention, not lying down with ice on her back, in the huddle, standing, participating in the competitive conversations happening among her teammates during what appeared to be a meaningful game moment. If a player has sustained a back injury of sufficient severity to prevent her from returning to the floor for the remainder of a competitive game, the protocol that professional sports organizations universally and consistently apply, training staff presence immediately, visible medical attention, some form of documented assessment occurring in real time at the sideline or in transit to the training room, was not visibly present in the footage that has circulated from this situation. In any professional sports context, across every major professional league with developed player health infrastructure, when a player leaves the game with a physical injury of the kind that prevents return, training staff are involved in a visible way. They walk with the player, they provide support, they conduct assessments. The footage of Clark's departure did not show what observers are characterizing as the normal visible indicators of an active, in-game medical response to an injury that prevented the most important player on the roster from returning to a meaningful competitive situation. Now let us be completely clear about what responsible analytical engagement with this evidence requires, because intellectual honesty demands it. The analytical community operating from external footage cannot determine with certainty what Clark's physical condition was at that moment or in the moments following. What happened in the training room, away from cameras, is not visible in the footage that has circulated. The internal organizational assessment of Clark's condition is not something external observers have access to. Those are the genuine and honest limits of what can be known from the outside. But we can describe what the documented footage shows. And what it shows is a specific sequence. Clark hit a three. Clark generated assists. Clark turned the ball over and did not sprint back defensively at the expected pace. White was visibly agitated and called the timeout. Clark was removed from the game. Clark was in the huddle afterward without visible training staff intervention. Clark walked to the locker room in a manner that did not include the visible medical accompaniment that professional sports injury protocols normally produce. And the broadcast provided no information about her status for an extended period that observers are estimating at over 30 minutes. That sequence is documented. It is visible. And within the full context of everything this Indiana Fever season has produced as evidence about the coaching relationship, the organizational patterns, and the competitive dynamics surrounding Clark, the sequence raises questions that the analytical community is not being irresponsible in articulating clearly and specifically. The coaching pattern that is most analytically relevant to this specific situation is one that has been documented across this entire season with increasing frequency and increasing specificity. Stephanie White has repeatedly removed Clark from games following individual competitive mistakes, turnovers, defensive lapses, moments where Clark made the human competitive errors that every professional basketball player makes, in ways that are not consistently applied to other players when they make comparable mistakes. Kelsey Mitchell's turnovers, her missed defensive assignments, her possessions that terminate in low-percentage individual shot attempts, these have not historically produced the same immediate coaching response of removing Mitchell from the game that Clark's single turnover in this specific game apparently produced. In this game, Clark had 19 points and 8 assists in the first half alone. She had just made a three-pointer and generated assists in the possessions immediately before the turnover. She was operating at an elite level. She made one mistake. She did not sprint back on defense as quickly as the coaching staff wanted. And what followed was her removal from the game and a subsequent back injury explanation for why she did not return. The analytical question that this specific sequence generates, grounded in documented footage and documented seasonal patterns rather than speculation, is whether the back situation is what prevented Clark's return, or whether the coaching decision was made first and the back injury became the organizational explanation for why the game continued without her. That question deserves to be asked directly and honestly, not because there is certainty about the answer, but because the documented evidence creates conditions in which the question is analytically legitimate and analytically necessary. The timing element of the back situation, as reported by Clark and the organization, is another specific element that the footage examination has highlighted. In the second quarter, with approximately 6 minutes remaining, there is footage that observers have identified as showing Clark appearing to react to some physical discomfort in her back area. However, and this is the analytically significant detail, Clark played 4 minutes of competitive basketball after that second quarter moment. She scored after that moment. She generated assists after that moment. She competed at an elite level after that moment. If a back injury was present and developing in the second quarter, it did not prevent Clark from playing 4 additional minutes at a high competitive level and producing meaningful individual output. That observation does not mean the back situation was not real or was not genuinely affecting her. But it does mean that the sequence from second quarter physical discomfort to third quarter exit following a turnover and a coaching timeout requires more than a simple linear injury progression narrative to fully account for the footage that exists. The most honest framing of what the analytical community can conclude from the documented evidence is this: there are multiple possible explanations for what happened, and the footage and the organizational patterns that surround it make the most straightforward injury-only explanation incomplete without additional transparency from the organization. That is not the same as concluding that the organizational explanation is false. It is concluding that the documented evidence demands more transparency than has been provided. The 30-plus minutes of broadcast silence about Clark's status following her departure is its own analytically significant data point that compounds the questions already generated by the footage. Broadcasts covering professional sports report on injured player situations in real time when those situations involve players of significance to the game's competitive outcome. When the most commercially and competitively important player in women's professional basketball leaves the floor unexpectedly during a meaningful game, The broadcast infrastructure that covers these games provides updates. The extended period without any information, while the game continued and while Indiana was competing without its most important player, is unusual and notable, regardless of what the eventual explanation was. All of this exists within the full context of what this Indiana Fever season has documented about how the organizational environment around Clark operates when situations arise that generate public scrutiny. The organization has demonstrated, repeatedly and specifically, that it responds quickly to organizational narratives it finds damaging, through player retractions, through public repositioning, through communications management that prioritizes controlling information rather than providing transparency. The speed with which the back injury narrative emerged following the game, contrasted with the 30-plus minutes of broadcast silence during the game itself, is a timing dynamic that observers are noting within that documented organizational context. The questions being asked are not invented. They are the natural analytical products of what the documented footage shows, what the seasonal patterns have established, and what the organizational behavior around this franchise's most important player has consistently produced as material for examination. What the Indiana Fever organization owes to Clark, to the fan community that has invested in her and in this team, to the analytical community that has been tracking this season's documented patterns, and to the broader institutional credibility of women's professional basketball, is complete transparency about what happened. What is Clark's actual physical status? What was the coaching decision-making process in the third quarter? What role, if any, did the individual competitive error play in the timing of her removal? And what does the training staff assessment of her condition show? These are not unreasonable questions. They are the natural and necessary questions that arise from the documented evidence of a specific game sequence, evaluated against the documented patterns of a full season of organizational behavior. The Indiana Fever organization has both the ability and the obligation to answer them clearly. If the back situation is genuine and requires rest and careful management, then the organizational priority must be ensuring Clark is properly treated, that her long-term health is protected, and that the competitive toll of this season's aggressive physical environments is addressed with the seriousness it deserves. Clark has been subjected to physical targeting throughout this season, including specific documented plays in the Mercury games that represents a cumulative physical burden on a player who is competing at an elite level under maximum organizational and competitive pressure simultaneously. But if the footage is showing what observers are characterizing it as showing, a coaching removal following a single competitive mistake, followed by an organizational narrative that frames the departure as injury-related, without the visible medical protocols that genuine in-game injury responses normally produce, then the accountability questions that raises are of the most serious kind. The footage exists. The sequence is documented. The seasonal patterns that give it interpretive context are part of the permanent analytical record. And the analytical community that has been tracking this situation with precision and consistency throughout this season is not going to accept organizational silence or organizational narrative management as adequate responses to what the documented evidence shows. Clark's competitive output in this game, 19 points and 8 assists in the first half, a three-pointer and assists in the third quarter sequence immediately before the turnover, is the performance record of a player who was producing at an elite level and who left the game after one mistake triggered a visible coaching response. Whether the back situation is the complete and sufficient explanation for everything that followed is the question the organization must answer, and the answer needs to match what the footage shows and what the documented patterns of this season have established as the organizational context within which this specific sequence occurred. The analytical community is watching. The fan community is watching, and the permanent record of what this Indiana Fever season has been, including this specific game, this specific sequence, and this specific departure, will reflect whatever the organization's transparency or its absence ultimately communicates about how it operates around the most important player in the history of women's professional basketball.